It was one of those evenings where everything seemed perfect for those who belonged to that world of glitter and glamour. The hotel's grand ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, and the sound of laughter floated through the air like music of its own. Expensive perfumes mixed with the aroma of roasted salmon, fine wine, and freshly baked bread. The guests wore the kind of elegance that came with wealth, diamonds catching the light, silk dresses whispering against marble floors, and men dressed in tailored suits, laughing loudly as if the world itself were theirs to own. In one corner of the room stood a grand piano, polished until it gleamed like glass. Its keys, untouched for most of the evening, seemed to wait for someone to awaken it. The pianist, who had been hired to play soft background music, had long finished his set, leaving the piano silent as the guests turned their attention to food, champagne, and conversation. Among them moved a young waitress, quietly and carefully, balancing a tray filled with sparkling glasses. She was dressed simply in a black uniform, her hair tied neatly, her expression calm and polite. Her movements were practiced, graceful even as she weaved through the crowd unnoticed. But every few minutes her eyes would drift toward the piano. It wasn't a look of curiosity, it was something deeper, something only a person who had once loved music could understand. She paused near the piano once, pretending to adjust the empty glasses on her tray, but really, she was listening to the faint echo of the notes that had been played earlier. For a brief moment she imagined herself sitting there, her fingers gliding across the keys, losing herself in a world where sound and emotion became one. But that was a dream she had left behind long ago. The life she lived now was practical, a series of shifts, bills, and responsibilities. There was no time for music anymore. Life had demanded sacrifices, and she had given them without question. Still, the pull of the piano was something she could never quite shake off. The event was being hosted by a wealthy businessman, a man known for his success and his larger-than-life personality. People called him the man with a golden touch. Wherever he went, attention followed. He was the type who loved being the center of every conversation, the type who believed charm could buy respect. As he laughed and toasted with his guests, the waitress could hear his booming voice from across the room. He noticed everything, especially when someone didn't fit into the glittering world he ruled. His eyes landed on the waitress at one point, watching her as she served drinks with quiet precision. He smirked slightly, whispering something to the people around him. They turned, looking at her, and laughter rippled through the table. The waitress felt their eyes on her but kept her head down, pretending not to notice. As the evening went on, the conversations became louder. The band had left and someone joked that the night needed a little entertainment. The businessman, always eager for attention, looked around and then glanced again at the waitress. He caught her gaze for just a second, enough to make her uncomfortable. He raised his glass and said loudly, "Maybe our lovely waitress here can play something for us." "You've been looking at that piano all evening, haven't you?" The words cut through the chatter and everyone turned to look at her. She froze, unsure how to respond. Her heart raced, and for a moment she felt exposed, as if he had read her thoughts. "Oh, come now," he said, standing with a grin. "Don't be shy. We could all use a bit of music, and you seem like you got something to show us." A few people chuckled, thinking it was just a bit of fun. But others sensed the unease in the air, the kind of mockery hidden behind a smile. The waitress tried to explain politely that she couldn't, that she was just doing her job. But the man waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Just one song. You know how to play, don't you?" The tension spread through the room like a quiet wind. Some guests avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. Others leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. The waitress took a slow breath. She didn't want to cause a scene. Her job was important to her. She couldn't afford to offend the guests. But walking toward that piano meant stepping into a memory she had buried for years. She placed her tray down carefully on a nearby table, her fingers trembling just slightly. Every eye in the room followed her as she walked toward the piano. The heels of her shoes clicked softly on the marble floor, echoing louder than the whispers around her. She could feel her heart beating in her throat. As she reached the piano, she stopped for a moment, staring at it. The polished surface reflected her face, not the face of the confident young girl who had once dreamed of playing on great stages, but that of a woman who had faced hardship, responsibility, and silence. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, almost afraid to press them down. The millionaire smirked from his seat, leaning back with his arms crossed. "Any time now," he said, his tone playful but sharp. The waitress closed her eyes for a moment. She could still remember her father sitting beside her when she was a little girl, guiding her fingers across the keyboard. He had always believed in her talent, calling her his little Melody. Those memories rushed back. The old piano at home, the long evenings of practice, the applause at small school recitals. She had dreamed of becoming a professional pianist once, even earned a scholarship to study music. But then her father fell ill and everything changed. The scholarship was lost when she couldn't continue her studies. Bills had to be paid and she took any job she could find. Playing piano became a luxury she could no longer afford. The years passed and her hands learned to carry trays instead of creating music. But deep inside, the music never left her. Now here she was, standing before a grand piano again. Not in a concert hall, not surrounded by musicians, but in front of strangers who didn't expect anything more than a joke. Her hands hovered over the keys, unsure. The room grew quiet. Even the millionaire's smirk began to fade as he sensed something shift in the air. The waitress inhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling as she gathered courage she didn't know she still had. When she pressed the first key, the sound was soft but clear, a single note that seemed to echo through the hall. She paused, her hands trembling slightly, then played another. Her fingers began to move with a rhythm that came naturally, instinctively, as if the piano had been waiting for her all this time. People stopped talking. The room, once filled with laughter and chatter, now listened. The notes flowed gently at first, then stronger, forming a melody that carried emotion no one expected. The waitress had not just accepted a dare. She had opened a door to her past, one note at a time. She wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She wasn't thinking about the millionaire or the people whispering. Her mind was lost in the music, her heart guiding her hands. The pain, the struggle, the quiet strength. It all came through her playing. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't awkward or mocking, it was filled with awe. No one spoke for a moment, not even the man who had dared her. He just stared, speechless, as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. But that silence would come later. For now, as she sat there, finishing that final note, she didn't yet realize what she had done. She had reminded everyone, including herself, that true talent doesn't need an invitation or a stage. Sometimes it just needs a single chance to be heard, and that chance was about to change everything. The crowd inside the grand ballroom sat frozen for a few long seconds after she touched the keys. The music she had played was not just beautiful. It was full of emotion, something that could only come from someone who had lived through pain, loss, and unspoken dreams. For a moment, no one moved, no one even breathed. Then, as the final note disappeared into the air, soft claps began to echo from the back of the room. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding. Some people stood up. Others looked around, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The waitress slowly lifted her fingers from the piano, her hands trembling slightly. She looked down, trying to calm her breathing, her heart racing faster than it had in years. She had not planned to play. She had not even thought she remembered how to. But once her fingers touched the keys, something deep inside her had awakened, something that had been silent for far too long. The millionaire who had dared her sat still, his glass of wine untouched. His usual smirk was gone. He was a man used to being in control of every room he walked into. But for the first time that evening, someone else had taken that power away, and she had done it without a word. The guests around him started whispering among themselves, some clapping louder, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few of them even approached the piano, asking the waitress where she had learned to play like that. But she stood quietly, unsure how to answer. She wasn't used to attention. All she wanted was to step away, back into the comfort of her quiet, unnoticed corner. She gave a polite smile, bowed her head slightly, and began to walk away. Her steps were soft, almost hesitant, as if she didn't fully believe what had just happened. She could feel eyes following her, admiration mixing with guilt. Even those who had laughed earlier now avoided looking at her directly, ashamed of their quick judgment. As she returned to the service area, one of the senior staff members, an older man who had worked in the hotel for years, approached her. "That was something special," he said quietly. "You just gave them something they'll never forget." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were distant, still lost in the echo of the music she had played. When she looked toward the ballroom again, the millionaire was standing now, glass in hand, trying to reclaim his voice. He laughed awkwardly and said something to lighten the mood, but his laughter didn't carry the same confidence as before. It was clear he had been humbled. Later that evening, when most guests had left and the hotel lights dimmed, she stayed behind to help clean up. The night had been long and her feet ached, but she didn't complain. As she wiped down a table, her gaze wandered once more toward the grand piano, now sitting silently in the corner. The polished surface still reflected the glow of the chandeliers. She felt drawn to it again, though she knew she couldn't play anymore. Her break was over, and her job awaited. But just as she turned away, she heard a voice behind her. "You didn't tell me you could play like that." It was the millionaire. He stood there, his tone softer than it had been earlier. He wasn't mocking her now, and there was a trace of respect, even wonder, in his voice. She looked at him briefly, unsure how to respond. "It's been a long time," she said quietly. "I used to play when I was younger." He stepped closer, curiosity in his eyes. "Used to?" That didn't sound like someone who used to play. That sounded like someone who was born for it. She smiled faintly and shook her head. "Life doesn't always let you do what you were born for." The man didn't reply at once. He stood there for a while, thinking about her words. The arrogance that had once filled his expression was gone. In its place was something more human, a kind of silent realization that money and status couldn't create what she had just shared through her music. After a pause, he said, "I didn't mean to embarrass you earlier. It was supposed to be a joke. I didn't expect—" He stopped himself, searching for the right words. "What you did out there. It changed the whole night." She didn't answer, only gave a small nod and continued cleaning the table. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Not from the work, but from the emotions the night had stirred. He stood there a bit longer before speaking again. "You know," he said, "people like you shouldn't be hiding behind trays. You belong on a stage." She gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes.
"Stages are for people who have time to dream," she said softly.
"I have bills to pay." Her words hit him harder than she realized. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by luxury, her simplicity and honesty felt like a mirror reflecting everything he had forgotten about real life, about struggle, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of people who never gave up. He watched as she walked away again, her black uniform blending into the dim light of the empty ballroom. For the first time, he felt something more than admiration. He felt a sense of regret. The next day, her life returned to its usual rhythm. Morning shifts, quick meals, the same quiet faces of her co-workers. But inside her, something was different. The sound of the piano still played in her mind. It was as if her fingers still remembered the warmth of the keys, the way the melody had flowed so effortlessly. She found herself humming softly while setting tables, something she hadn't done in years. That night had woken something in her, a small spark of the person she used to be. During her short break that afternoon, she sat near the staff entrance, sipping tea and staring out the window. The city was alive outside. Cars rushing by, people talking, children laughing in the distance. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She thought about how it felt when everyone had fallen silent during her performance, not because she wanted their praise, but because in that moment she had found herself again. Later that evening, as she arrived for another shift, she was surprised to see the same millionaire in the lobby. He wasn't surrounded by his usual crowd this time. He stood quietly near the reception desk, holding a bouquet of white lilies. She hesitated before walking past, unsure if she should say anything. He noticed her and smiled slightly. "I was hoping I'd see you," he said. "I wanted to thank you properly for last night." She blinked, unsure how to react. "There's no need for that. It was just music." "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "It wasn't just music. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, how real talent doesn't need an audience to shine." She stayed silent, still unsure what to say. "I made some calls today," he continued. "There's a small charity event next week. No fancy guests, just an open performance for local artists. I'd like you to play there. If you agree, of course." Her eyes widened slightly. "I haven't played in years." "That night was just," he interrupted gently. "That night was you being yourself." That's what people want to hear. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The idea of performing again, of stepping in front of people willingly, scared her. But deep down, the thought of touching the piano again filled her with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Finally, she said softly, "I'll think about it." He nodded with a small smile. "That's all I ask." He handed her the flowers before leaving, and as she held them, she felt warmth spread through her chest. That evening, after her shift ended, she walked past the grand piano once more. The hall was empty, quiet except for the faint sound of the air conditioner. She placed the lilies on the piano and sat down again. Her hands hovered over the keys. She pressed a few softly, letting the sound fill the space. The same melody from the night before came back to her. But this time, it wasn't born out of fear or pressure. It was gentle, steady, full of life. She closed her eyes and smiled to herself. Maybe life had taken her far from her dreams, but it hadn't taken the dream itself away. It had only been waiting for her to be brave enough to touch it again. And as the soft notes filled the empty room, she realized that sometimes the hardest journeys lead us right back to where we were meant to be all along. The morning light filtered softly through her small apartment window. The sound of traffic outside was steady, familiar, and ordinary. But inside her heart, things no longer felt ordinary. Ever since that night in the ballroom, her mind kept drifting back to the piano. The applause, the silence before it, the look on people's faces, it all replayed in her memory again and again. She tried to focus on her usual routine, making tea, ironing her uniform, and preparing for her shift. But her thoughts refused to quiet down. Something inside her had changed forever. She had played that night because she had no choice. It was a dare, a moment of pressure she hadn't planned for. Yet when her fingers touched the keys, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The music had come out of her like it had been waiting, trapped and silent deep in her soul. And now, every time she passed a piano in the hotel, she felt that same pull, like the instrument was calling her back. At work that day, everything seemed to move slower. She smiled politely at guests, served food, cleared tables, but her mind wandered elsewhere. Every sound reminded her of rhythm. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of the air conditioner, even the way footsteps echoed on the marble floors. It all turned into music in her imagination. Later that afternoon, as she refilled the guests' glasses, she overheard a group of them talking about the same charity event the millionaire had mentioned. "I heard there'll be live performances," one of them said. "He's organizing it himself. Apparently he's looking for new raw talent, people who haven't been discovered yet." Her heart gave a small jolt. She remembered his words from the other night. "You belong on a stage." She had smiled at the time and brushed it off, but now she wondered if he had really meant it. Was he serious about her performing? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. As the evening shift ended, she went to the back area to change into her regular clothes. Her hands were sore from carrying trays, her feet aching from standing all day. She sat down for a few minutes, staring at the floor, lost in thought. She wanted to believe that life might be offering her a second chance. But another part of her whispered, "Don't be foolish. Dreams don't feed you, work does." When she reached home that night, she took out an old box from under her bed. Inside were photos, a few letters, and some worn-out sheet music, pieces she had practiced long ago. Her fingers brushed against the faded notes and tears welled up in her eyes. Each page held a memory, a part of her she had hidden away. She picked one sheet and placed it on her small wooden table. Then, with a shaky breath, she whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time." The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. She didn't tell anyone, but she decided to visit a nearby music school where she used to practice as a teenager. The building was old now, but when she walked through the entrance, a flood of nostalgia hit her. The familiar scent of polished wood, the faint sound of students practicing in distant rooms. It all brought back memories she thought were gone. One of the instructors, an older woman with kind eyes, recognized her almost instantly. "It's been a long time," she said warmly. "I thought you had moved away." "I almost did," she replied softly. "Life got in the way." The woman nodded knowingly. "It always does. But the music never leaves, does it?" She smiled. "No, it doesn't." The woman showed her to one of the smaller practice rooms. Inside was an upright piano, slightly worn but still beautiful. She sat down, feeling nervous like she was meeting an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Her fingers hovered above the keys before she finally began to play. At first, the notes were uneven. Her hands were stiff, her timing off. But as she continued, the old rhythm began to return. The sound filled the small room, and soon her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. Every movement, every touch of a key felt like rediscovering a part of herself. When she finished, she sat still for a long time, tears quietly running down her cheeks. It wasn't sadness, and it was relief. For so many years, she had believed that part of her life was gone. But here it was, still alive, still waiting. Over the next few days, she visited the school again and again. She practiced for hours before and after her work shifts, sometimes skipping meals just to have more time at the piano. The other teachers began to notice her dedication. Even the students admired her, though they didn't know her story. Each night when she returned home, she felt both exhausted and fulfilled. It was as if her life had found rhythm again, not the rhythm of work and bills, but of purpose. The music was healing her from the inside out. One evening, as she left the music school, she found the millionaire waiting near the entrance. He looked different, less like the boastful man she had met at the party and more like someone who was genuinely interested. "I was hoping you'd be here," he said. "I wanted to see if you thought about what I asked." She hesitated, clutching her small bag. "I have," she said finally. "I've been practicing again." His face lit up. "That's good. There's still a spot open for the charity performance next week. I'd like you to play." "I'm not sure I'm ready," she admitted. "It's been too long. What if I make mistakes?" "What if," he interrupted gently. "Mistakes are fine. People don't remember perfect performances. They remember the ones that come from the heart, and you play from the heart." She looked at him, uncertain. "Why are you doing this?" "You don't even know me." He smiled, though his eyes looked thoughtful. "Maybe I don't. But I know what it's like to lose something you love. Money can buy many things, but not that feeling, the one you gave everyone in that room." He reminded me that passion still exists in this world. I want others to see it too. She didn't answer right away. A part of her wanted to say no, to stay in the safety of her quiet life. But deep down she knew this was her chance, the one she had waited for without realizing it. Finally, she said softly, "All right, I'll do it." The following days passed quickly. Between work and practice, she barely had time to rest. The other staff at the hotel began to notice her energy, how her eyes sparkled a little more, how she hummed softly while working. Even the manager, who was usually strict, smiled at her one morning and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You seem alive again." At home, she continued to practice every night on a small keyboard she had borrowed from the music school. The sound wasn't the same as a real piano, but it was enough. She poured her emotions into every note, remembering her father, the struggles, the loneliness, everything that had shaped her. The night before the charity event, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with both excitement and fear. What if she failed? What if the audience didn't feel what she felt? But then she reminded herself, she wasn't doing this for applause. She was doing it for the girl she once was, for the dream she had buried too soon. When the day of the event arrived, she woke early and dressed simply but neatly. The venue wasn't as grand as the hotel ballroom, but it was beautiful in its own way. A cozy community hall filled with warm lights and people who looked kind rather than proud. Musicians of all ages were preparing for their turns, tuning instruments, whispering words of encouragement to one another. She waited quietly backstage, her hands slightly trembling. The millionaire was there too, organizing things, greeting guests, and occasionally glancing her way with a reassuring smile. When her name was finally called, her heart skipped a beat. She stepped onto the small stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. The audience was quiet, waiting. For a second, she wanted to turn around and run, but then she took a deep breath, walked to the piano, and sat down. As her fingers touched the keys, all the noise in her mind faded. It was just her and the music again. The first few notes flowed gently, and soon everything else disappeared. She wasn't thinking about who was watching. She wasn't thinking about the past or the pain. She was only feeling, and letting those feelings pour out through every note she played. The melody was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger, fuller, carrying her story without words. The audience sat motionless, completely drawn in. Even those who didn't understand music could feel the honesty in her playing. It was real, raw, and deeply human. When she reached the final note, she held it for a moment, letting it linger in the air. Then silence went, a deep emotional silence that said more than words ever could. And then came the applause. Loud, heartfelt, genuine applause that filled the entire hall. People stood up, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. She looked out at them, overwhelmed, her heart full. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, understood, and alive. At the side of the stage, the millionaire clapped too, his eyes shining with pride. And in that moment, she realized something. Sometimes life doesn't take your dreams away. It only hides them, waiting for the right moment to bring them back. And that night, under the soft glow of stage lights, her dream had finally found its way home again. The night of the charity event began with a sense of excitement and quiet anticipation. People arrived from all over the city, filling the community hall with a mixture of laughter, greetings, and soft chatter. The space was warm and inviting, decorated simply with strings of fairy lights and small bouquets on every table. There were musicians tuning instruments in one corner, singers practicing quietly in another, and volunteers bustling about, making sure everything was ready. The atmosphere was different from the glittering hotel ballroom. Here there was no pretense, no judgment, only a sense of shared purpose, a feeling that everyone had come to celebrate talent and passion. Backstage, the waitress, now the performer, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. Even after all the practice, the hours of preparation, and the previous night's rehearsal, she felt a flutter of nerves. This was not just about playing the piano. This was about revealing herself, her story, her emotions to strangers. She wondered if she would be able to reach them the way she had in the ballroom, the way she had dreamed of doing for years. The millionaire was nearby, adjusting microphones and checking details. He noticed her quiet tension and approached gently. "You're going to be amazing," he said. His voice was calm, reassuring, unlike the teasing tone of that first night at the hotel. "Just remember, you're not performing for me or anyone else. You're performing for yourself. Let them hear what you feel." She nodded, grateful for his words, but still feeling the weight of the moment. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the piano, imagining the keys beneath her fingers, imagining the music flowing freely. She felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with fear, but she also felt something new, courage. The first performer before her had finished, and the applause filled the hall. The audience was warm and attentive, people who genuinely wanted to support the artists on stage. Then came her cue. She walked out slowly, feeling the stage beneath her feet, the lights bright and a little intimidating. The audience turned, curious to see the next performer. She walked toward the piano, set her bag aside, and gently pressed her fingers against the keys. The first note was soft, almost tentative, but it carried with it the weight of everything she had held inside for years. The audience leaned in, sensing the emotion behind the music. Each note she played grew stronger, more confident, yet filled with tenderness. Her hands moved naturally, effortlessly, as if they remembered a language she had always known. The melody flowed like a river, full of emotion, memory, and heart. As she played, she remembered the early days of her music. The long evenings spent at the old upright piano in her childhood home, her father's gentle encouragement, the feeling of joy when she learned a difficult piece. Those memories fueled her playing, bringing depth and richness to every chord. She felt her fingers dance over the keys, telling stories of love, loss, hope, and resilience. The audience sat in silence, captivated. Some closed their eyes, letting the music fill their minds. Others watched her carefully, sensing the authenticity and raw talent emanating from each note. There were no distractions, no whispers, no impatience. It was as if the world had paused to listen to her story. Even the millionaire, who had seen her perform before, felt a deep sense of awe. He had been used to wealth and influence, to commanding attention, to impressing crowds. But here, in this simple hall filled with ordinary people, he realized that true power lay not in status or money, but in the ability to touch hearts. He leaned forward in his chair, watching her every movement, amazed at how someone so quiet, so unassuming, could hold the attention of an entire room. She continued playing, losing herself in the music. Every note she struck was filled with emotion, Her struggles, her sacrifices, the years of hidden dreams. The hall seemed to breathe with her, the audience responding not just to the sound but to the feeling behind it. She felt connected to every person there, as if the music had created an invisible thread linking them together. At one point, she faltered slightly, a single note hesitating under her fingers. For a moment, panic threatened to take over, but she quickly regained control. She smiled faintly to herself and let the music guide her. The audience didn't notice the small stumble. They were too absorbed in the story she was telling through the piano. As the piece reached its climax, the music swelled, filling every corner of the hall with sound and emotion. Her hands moved faster, yet gracefully, pouring everything she had into the performance. The final chords resonated, lingering in the air like a soft echo of her soul. She held the last note, letting it fade naturally, then slowly lifted her hands from the keys. For a moment, there was silence. The audience sat stunned, unsure of how to react. And then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. The sound was overwhelming, but it was not just applause for her skill. It was gratitude, admiration, and recognition of her courage to share something so deeply personal. She sat there for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Her heart raced and tears filled her eyes. It was a mix of relief, joy, and disbelief. She had done it. She had shared a piece of herself with the world, and it had been received with warmth and respect. After she left the stage, the millionaire approached her again. He looked genuinely impressed, his previous arrogance replaced with admiration. "You were incredible," he said softly. "I don't think anyone there has ever felt music like that before." She shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. I just played what I felt," she said. "That's all." "But that's exactly it," he replied. "That's why it was so powerful. People can hear when music comes from the heart. You reminded everyone tonight what that feels like." She smiled faintly, her hands still shaking from the intensity of the performance. I never imagined people would respond like that." "They did," he said, nodding, "and they will remember it for a long time. You have a gift, and you shouldn't hide it anymore." The evening continued, with more performers taking the stage, but the memory of her performance lingered. People talked about it for hours, praising her talent and her courage. Even other musicians approached her afterward, complimenting her skill and asking how she had learned to play with such emotion. She responded politely, smiling, but inside she felt a quiet satisfaction. Backstage, she took a moment to herself. She looked at the piano, now empty and silent, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The music had done more than entertain. It had healed something within her, reminded her of who she truly was and what she was capable of. As the night drew to a close, she walked home under the soft glow of streetlights. Her footsteps felt lighter than usual, her heart full. The city around her was quiet yet alive, much like the music she had played. She realized that this night had changed her. It wasn't just about the applause or the recognition. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. The next morning, she woke with a sense of purpose. She knew she wanted to continue playing, to explore her talent further and to see where it could take her. The charity event had shown her that the world was ready to hear her story. And more importantly, she was ready to tell it. Over the following weeks, she began to practice daily, balancing her work at the hotel with her passion for music. She even began taking small lessons at the music school, refining her technique and exploring new pieces. Each day she felt her confidence grow, her fingers moving more effortlessly across the keys. The millionaire continued to support her quietly, attending a few of her practice sessions and offering encouragement. He never pressured her, never demanded anything. He simply reminded her of her talent and the impact it could have. His presence was comforting, a reminder that someone believed in her when she had doubted herself for so long. One afternoon, after a particularly long practice, she sat by the window of the music school, looking out at the bustling street below. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the years of sacrifice, the hidden dreams, the doubts and fears, and she realized that every step, every struggle had led her to this moment. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of true freedom. She was no longer just a waitress serving drinks in a grand ballroom. She was a musician, a storyteller, someone who could touch hearts through her art. And that realization filled her with a quiet, unshakable joy. The days turned into weeks, and the community began to recognize her talent. Small local events invited her to perform. Friends and neighbors spoke of her skill, and each performance, no matter how small, gave her a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She felt alive in a way that nothing else had ever given her, and through it all she never forgot that first night, the night she had been dared to play, the night that had changed everything. It had been a moment of courage, a spark that had ignited a fire she thought she had lost. It had shown her that true talent could never be buried forever, and that the heart, when brave enough, could create something unforgettable. She often returned to the piano late at night, long after the world had gone quiet. She played for herself, for the memories, for the joy of feeling music flow through her. Each note was a reminder that she had reclaimed a part of her soul and that nothing, not even years of doubt or hardship, could take it away again. And in the stillness of those late nights, with the soft glow of a lamp and the gentle hum of the city outside, she knew one thing with certainty. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and her journey was only just beginning. The weeks after the charity performance became a turning point in her life. Each day she awoke with a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The memory of that night and the way her music had touched people filled her with quiet determination. Work at the hotel continued, of course, with long hours and the constant movement of trays and orders. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer felt like a shadow moving unnoticed through a world of grandeur. Instead, she carried a spark of confidence, a sense that she could step forward and claim the life she had always dreamed of. Her days began earlier now, as she practiced on the small keyboard she had borrowed from the music school before heading to work. She would run through scales, old pieces, and new melodies she had written herself. Her fingers remembered what her mind sometimes forgot, and slowly her playing became smoother, more confident. Every note felt like a message to herself, a reminder that she had not lost her talent, only postponed it. At the hotel, the staff noticed the change immediately. She moved with a new kind of grace, smiling more easily at guests and coworkers alike. People commented on how energized she seemed, how her presence made the work environment lighter, even though the workload was just as heavy. Her coworkers, some of whom had been with her for years, could sense that something extraordinary was happening in her life, even if they didn't know the full story. The Millionaire continued to support her quietly, attending some of her small practice sessions at the music school. He never demanded anything from her or tried to control her choices. Instead, he offered advice when she asked for it and encouragement when she doubted herself. His presence was steady, a reminder that someone believed in her even when she was uncertain. One afternoon, he invited her to a private event at a smaller venue, a local gathering of music lovers and artists. He explained that it was informal, with no pressure, just an opportunity for her to perform in front of a supportive audience. She agreed hesitantly, nervous about stepping into the spotlight again. The thought of playing in front of people, even friendly faces, still made her heart race. When the day arrived, she arrived early to practice. The venue was modest, with wooden floors, warm lighting, and a small stage that barely rose above the audience. Musicians were setting up, testing microphones, tuning guitars, and chatting quietly. She sat at the piano, her hands brushing over the keys, feeling both anticipation and a sense of calm. Her first notes were cautious, soft, and deliberate, but soon the music began to flow naturally. She played with emotion, letting her heart guide her fingers, telling stories without words. The audience was attentive, leaning in as though every note carried meaning beyond sound. Some closed their eyes, absorbing the melodies, while others simply watched her with admiration. The atmosphere was intimate, different from the grandiosity of the charity event, yet no less powerful. As she played, memories of her journey surfaced. The long years of sacrifices, the nights she had stayed awake practicing alone, the moments of doubt, and the small triumphs that reminded her of her love for music. Each chord carried those experiences. Each note conveyed the resilience she had cultivated over time. She realized that this performance wasn't just for the audience. It was for herself, a celebration of the person she had become despite everything she had endured. After she finished, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. People stood cheering, clapping, and some even whistling in appreciation. She stood slowly, her hands still trembling, and allowed herself a small bow. The applause was different this time. It felt personal, genuine, and untainted by the superficial expectations of wealth or status. She felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The millionaire approached her once the applause died down. "You were magnificent," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. "You've grown so much in such a short time. The emotion you put into your music, it's incredible," she smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you," she said. "It feels different this time." "More mine," he nodded. "Exactly. That's what makes it powerful. You've taken your past, your struggles, your experiences, and turned them into something that can touch others. That's rare. Most people never get that chance." She looked down, her fingers brushing the keys absently. "I never thought I would play again like this. I thought that part of my life was gone forever." He shook his head gently. "It was never gone. It was waiting for the right moment and in the right person. You've given yourself that moment." Over the next few weeks, she performed at several small gatherings, local community events, and music school recitals. Each performance boosted her confidence, honed her skills, and allowed her to connect with audiences in ways she had only dreamed of. People began to recognize her talent, sharing stories of her music with friends and family. She became known as someone whose playing carried honesty and emotion, someone who didn't just perform but told stories through her music. Even at the hotel, her reputation began to grow. Guests who had attended the charity event or local performances mentioned her by name, praising her talent and curiosity about her next performance. Her coworkers noticed the shift too, the quiet pride she carried and the subtle confidence that radiated from her. She had changed, and everyone around her sensed it. One evening, after a long day at work, she returned home to find a letter waiting for her. It was an invitation to perform at a larger community event, one that would feature several established musicians alongside emerging talent. The letter explained that the organizers had heard about her from previous performances and wanted her to be part of the program. Her heart skipped a beat as she read it. This was the next step, an opportunity she had never imagined. She called the music school to reserve practice time, determined to prepare thoroughly. Her days became a careful balance of work, practice, and rest. She focused on building her repertoire, exploring new pieces, and perfecting her technique. Each practice session brought a sense of accomplishment and joy, reminding her that every moment of effort was a step toward her dream. At home, she often sat by her window late at night, reflecting on how far she had come. The small apartment that once felt confining now seemed like a sanctuary, a place where she could focus on her growth and her music. She thought about the first night she had dared to play at the hotel, the applause that had followed, and the sense of purpose that had been reignited. She realized that her life was no longer just about survival. It was about living fully, embracing her talent and sharing it with the world. The community event arrived, and she was both excited and nervous. The hall was larger than any she had performed in recently, with a stage that rose above the audience and lights that shone warmly on the performers. She arrived early, setting up and practicing briefly on the piano, feeling the familiar connection between her fingers and the keys. When it was her turn, she walked to the stage with steady steps. The audience was attentive, their faces filled with curiosity and expectation. She seated herself at the piano and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the calm settle over her. Then she began to play. The music started gently, weaving a story that was both intimate and expansive. Her fingers moved gracefully, creating melodies that carried emotion and depth. She played with confidence, letting the music flow naturally and freely without hesitation. The audience responded immediately, leaning in to listen, captivated by the richness of her performance. As she continued, memories of her journey surfaced, each one adding to the emotion in her playing. She remembered the nights of practice, the doubts, the small victories, the encouragement from her father, and the moment she had first dared to play at the hotel. All of it shaped her music, giving it depth and meaning that went far beyond technical skill. The audience was silent for much of her performance, absorbed in the story she was telling through the piano. Some closed their eyes, feeling the emotion in each note, while others watched her carefully, sensing the authenticity and honesty in her playing. Even the more experienced musicians present were impressed by the maturity and depth of her performance. By the time she reached the final notes, the hall was filled with an almost tangible energy. She held the last chord, letting it resonate fully, then slowly lifted her hands from the keys. Silence filled the room for a moment, heavy and profound, before applause erupted. People stood clapping, cheering, and some even wiped tears from their eyes. She stood slowly, overwhelmed by the response. Her heart raced and a mix of relief and joy washed over her. She had done it again, not for recognition, not for approval, but because she had shared a piece of herself. The audience had received it with warmth and appreciation, and in that moment she felt truly alive. Backstage, the millionaire approached her, a proud smile on his face. "You've grown so much," he said softly. "Every time I see you perform, I'm reminded of how extraordinary your talent is. You've inspired everyone here tonight." She shook her head, smiling through tears. "I didn't think I could do it. I was afraid I wouldn't be enough." "But you were," he replied. "You always were. You just needed to believe it yourself." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. She continued to perform at various events, gradually building a reputation as a talented and emotionally compelling pianist. She began receiving invitations from larger venues, music schools, and community programs, each one offering a new opportunity to share her gift. Through it all, she remained humble and grounded, never forgetting the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the first night at the hotel, the doubt, the dare, and the courage it had taken to play. She remembered her father's encouragement, the years of sacrifice, and the resilience that had kept her going. Each performance was a tribute to that journey, a celebration of the person she had become. And as she continued to play, to grow, and to inspire, she realized that her life had changed in ways she had never imagined. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a bridge between her past and her future, a way to connect with others, and a reminder that talent and passion, once discovered, could never truly be hidden. Her journey was far from over. Each performance, each new opportunity was a step forward, a chance to explore the depths of her music and her own potential. She knew that challenges would come, that doubt and fear might return, but she also knew something more important, that she had found her voice, and it would never be silenced again. The music had given her courage, and that courage had opened a world she had once thought unreachable, and now, with every note she played, she stepped further into the life she had always dreamed of, a life where her talent, her passion, and her heart could shine without fear or hesitation. The next few weeks changed everything for Lena. The cafe that once echoed with the sound of coffee cups and quiet chatter now buzzed with curiosity. People from nearby towns came just to see the piano where she had played that night. Some asked her to perform again, while others simply wanted to meet the girl who had silenced an entire room with her music. Lena smiled shyly at all the attention, still not quite believing any of it was real. She continued working her shifts, though now with a quiet glow of hope she hadn't felt in years. Mr. Caldwell visited often. He wasn't the same man who had once smirked while daring her to play. There was something softer in his voice now, a genuine respect. One morning he entered the cafe carrying a small tablet and motioned her over. "You should see this," he said, placing it on the counter. The video of her piano performance was online, and it already had millions of views. People had shared it across social media with comments full of awe and emotion. Some wrote how her playing reminded them of lost dreams. Others said it gave them courage to follow their own. Lena covered her mouth in disbelief as tears filled her eyes. She had never imagined something so small, a dare, a moment of courage, could reach so far. Within days, journalists called the cafe asking for interviews. Music teachers, producers, and schools reached out, offering her lessons and opportunities. The cafe owner, proud and teary-eyed, told her that if she ever needed time off to chase her dream, she could take it without worry. Lena didn't know how to react. For so long, life had been about surviving one day at a time. Now doors she never knew existed were opening in front of her. It was both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, Caldwell found her sitting by the piano after closing. The lights were dim and she was softly pressing keys, lost in thought. He sat at a nearby table, watching her with a calm smile. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "Don't let fear make you doubt it." She looked up and confessed that she wasn't sure she deserved all the attention. "I'm just a waitress who used to love music," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "No, you're an artist who forgot how bright her light could be. The world just reminded you." Encouraged by his words, Lena decided to accept one of the offers, a chance to study music again in the city. The scholarship covered her tuition, and Caldwell even helped her find a small apartment near the school. Saying goodbye to the cafe was emotional. Her coworkers hugged her, promising to visit when she performed someday. The owner placed a small note in her hand before she left. It read, "Don't ever let life make you quiet again." The city was louder, faster, and much bigger than what she was used to. But every time she felt overwhelmed, she thought of that night in the cafe, the warmth of the music, the stunned faces, the applause that still echoed in her mind. At the academy, she worked harder than anyone else, staying late to practice until her fingers ached. Her instructors were amazed at her raw emotion. They said her playing wasn't just technical, it was honest. It carried stories that people could feel without words. Months passed and Lena began performing at small local events. Each time she sat at the piano, she felt that same nervous flutter, followed by calm when her hands touched the keys. People listened quietly, just like they had that night in the cafe. They didn't see a former waitress. They saw a musician who poured her heart into every note. Caldwell continued to support her from a distance, attending her performances whenever he could. He never took credit for anything. He said she had done it all herself. He had only opened a door that was already waiting for her to walk through. One evening, after one of her concerts, he visited her backstage. "You know," he said with a smile, "I started that night just trying to pass time before a meeting. I never thought it would change both our lives." Lena laughed softly, replying, "I guess life finds strange ways to surprise us." Her big moment came when a well-known music foundation invited her to perform at a charity gala. It was the same event where Caldwell had once been the honored guest years ago. Now he would attend again, not as the center of attention, but to watch her take the stage. When the night arrived, the grand hall glowed with light and murmurs of an elegant crowd. Lena stood behind the curtains, her heart pounding as she looked at the shining piano on stage. For a moment, she felt like that same nervous waitress again, unsure and trembling, but then she remembered the cafe, the sound of the rain outside, the warmth of the applause, and how music had always been her home. The host announced her name, and she walked onto the stage. The audience fell silent as she sat at the piano. For a few seconds, she simply closed her eyes. Then her fingers began to move, weaving a melody that was both tender and powerful. It was the same song she had played that night in the cafe, the piece that had changed everything. Each note told her story, the loss, the struggle, the courage, and the rebirth of a forgotten dream. People leaned forward, drawn into the emotion of her music. Some smiled, some wiped away tears, and others simply closed their eyes to listen. When the final note lingered in the air, there was a long, deep silence. Then the audience rose to their feet, applauding louder and longer than she had ever imagined. Lena stood up slowly, tears shining in her eyes as she bowed. In the front row, she saw Caldwell clapping, his expression full of pride. He nodded slightly as if to say, "You did it." After the performance, people gathered around her, congratulating her and asking about her journey. She spoke humbly, saying she was just grateful for a second chance. Later that night, as the hall emptied, she found Caldwell standing by the exit, waiting. He smiled warmly. "You've come a long way," he said. "From serving coffee to serving music to the world." Lena laughed, shaking her head. "I still make a mean cup of coffee," she said. They both laughed quietly before he added, "I hope you never stop playing. The world needs what you have." In the months that followed, Lena's name became known among musicians and listeners alike. She recorded her first album, a simple collection of piano pieces inspired by real emotions and everyday life. She dedicated it to her mother, who was recovering and often listened to her daughter's music with tears of joy. The album cover showed a picture of the old cafe piano, polished and lit by a single lamp. She titled it The Dare. Whenever she visited her hometown, Lena always stopped by the cafe. The piano still stood in the corner, now shining proudly. Sometimes she would sit down and play a soft tune, drawing smiles from customers who recognized her. The cafe owner kept a framed picture of her near the counter, with a handwritten note that read, "Dreams don't expire." One rainy evening, much like that first night, a young waiter approached her shyly as she played. "Miss Lena," he said, "is it true you were once a waitress here?" She smiled and nodded. "Yes, and I loved every bit of it." He hesitated, then whispered, "I play guitar, but I'm too scared to perform in front of people." She looked at him kindly and said, "I know that fear. But the moment you play for yourself, not for others, that fear goes away." He nodded slowly, her words sinking in. As she walked out into the rain, Umbrella in hand, she looked up at the glowing cafe sign and smiled. Life had come full circle. She remembered how one small moment, a dare, a challenge, and a little courage had opened a new world. Now she carried that lesson wherever she went. Years later, during an interview, a journalist asked her what advice she would give to others chasing their dreams. She paused before replying, "Don't wait for someone to notice your light. Shine anyway. Sometimes all it takes is one person to remind you of what you were meant to do." Her words spread online, just like her first video had. People found hope in them, believing that even the quietest hearts could make the loudest music. Lena continued performing, teaching, and inspiring others. She never forgot the man who dared her, the cafe that gave her a stage, or the melody that started it all. Her story wasn't about luck or fame. It was about rediscovering what she loved and sharing it with the world. And every time she sat at a piano, whether in a concert hall or a small cafe, she began with the same soft touch, the same calm breath, and the same quiet promise she made to herself years ago, to never let her music stay silent again.